Welcome, everybody, and happy Monday. This is a special episode of InfoSec Unplugged. It's actually going to be a special two-part episode this week and next week. I am your humble and gracious host, Davin Jackson, also known as DJax Alpha. Thank you for joining. Today's episode, or today's presentation, is actually one that's very important to me, as well as several people who I've been talking to over the course of the last year and a half. Obviously, with everything that's going on with, 2020 and everything that's just been going on, whether, losing people left and right due to the pandemic or for other reasons, it's caused a big strain on everybody, not just in the InfoSec community, but just everybody as a whole. And I've been trying to bring some type of light to that. Whether it was with the conversation I had with Brandon Robinson or having just, conversations throughout the episodes I've had of InfoSec Unplugged. And I really wanted to do something where I could have someone speak to a lot of the things that's going on and how we as a people just from all over, how we can deal with it, how we can, learn to navigate through life as we know it as of right now. But anyone who knows me knows I'm not one to kind of just speak on things that I don't know or speak on things that I'm not qualified to speak about. So I didn't really know how to make that happen. And luckily for me, a friend of the show, Dwayne Dunstan, you may have known, you saw him before, the professor. He actually, if you followed him on Twitter this weekend, you'll notice that there's going to be some changes made with him, thanks to everybody. But he came to me with an idea, because I guess he was also noticing a lot of the same things, especially on Twitter, with conversations that we've been having just throughout the community. And he came to me and told me, his wife wanted to do a talk on dealing with the same things that we're dealing with today. And she's a professional, so it was like a no-brainer to make it happen. Before I bring them on, I just do want to give a quick disclaimer that this isn't technically like a therapy session. So, please, this isn't to be taken literal. These are, based on her experience and her professional opinion on how we can deal with things. And, I don't want anyone to just think that this is like the end all be all. This is the only thing that can be done. There's several different things you can do, and she's just going to bring light to some of them. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, everybody watching, please welcome my guests, Megan and Dwayne Dunstan. Let me bring you guys in.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity and hope that the session this evening and next week will answer some questions that people have, provide some resources and some frameworks to understand probably a lot of things that you all have been going through, that we've all been going through, and maybe didn't have the vocabulary or a framework to make sense of them. So those are some of my hopes for these sessions, and appreciate the opportunity. So in terms of introduction, I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor in the state of Vermont, and I'm not licensed to practice in other states, which is why the disclaimer at the beginning, for those of you who happen to not be in Vermont. And I specialize in a type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. And the reason I mention that is that a big part of the theory that I practice focuses on coping. So where I plan to go this evening is to talk about loss, to talk about grief and common experiences with grief, and then to provide a lot of coping skill knowledge and strategies to help manage the emotions, the processes that we're going through, both as a world in this pandemic, as well as individuals, and the many, many kinds of losses that we've had over the course of our lifetime, and the complex and compounded loss that we can experience as we accumulate losses through the life course, and then particularly in times like this last year has been full of. And I welcome you to, Dwayne's going to be looking at the questions. So if you do have questions along the line, definitely want to address as many of those as I can. So please feel free, and I invite you to reach out throughout this process. So we're going to start with just a general kind of overview of loss.
Hold on one second. I'm just going to bring that in now. Bring the slides in, and let's see here. You guys still there?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you. I just want to make sure. There we go. And bring this down here. All right, Megan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So first, we'll talk about the various types of loss. I think when we hear the words grief and loss, we often think of death, and that certainly is a life event that in which we do grieve, and grief is an ongoing process. So we'll talk about that as well. I also want to acknowledge that there are many types of losses that we grieve, and sometimes in our society we don't necessarily recognize or validate the other forms of loss that bring a legitimate grief process with them as well. So when I say grief and loss, I don't just mean in the context of death, although those certainly are included. So any other forms of loss would be included in that, and that might mean the loss of identity, the loss of certain roles that we may identify with. I think that with so many people losing their jobs this year, I imagine that there was grief around those employment opportunities or even that role of worker. The research would indicate that those who've been socialized as male maybe identify with a job role more so than some of the other relational roles that they hold. So I imagine many people listening might have struggled with that form of loss this year. The loss of being able to take for granted that we're safe. I know different segments of the population have already known that they are not safe in a variety of contexts, but for those who did feel more of a sense of safety prior to COVID, that not being able to take for granted that we can just be safe in various spaces, particularly in public. Loss of autonomy and loss of expectations of what we thought life would look like. I've worked with so many people this year around grief, around not having a graduation, for example, not having the prom, loss around not getting together with the family for the family reunion, and maybe some family members not making it to the next family reunion. So all of those kind of fantasy future visions that we had, all of those that were not able to happen are a form of loss. And as we identify the different forms of loss, and we can see that through the lens of grief, it can give us a framework to help us make sense of what's going on, and maybe as painful as it is, for things to feel less chaotic, and to give ourselves more grace as we would extend that to people that we would see as in mourning. Just like the mourner receives compassion, and we feel like that someone in mourning is entitled to anger and sadness, numbness, nonlinear healing, that we extend that same grace to ourselves as we recognize the various ways in which we are mourning or in which we are grieving, to legitimize that experience that we're having. So I'm going to briefly go over 4 types of grief that we experience that in addition to death. So loss of identity or affiliation. So some examples of that would include anyone who's grieving the loss of the role of spouse, for example, for someone who survives a cancer and maybe has parts of their body removed in order to recover. So coming to terms with that loss and having to rethink kind of identity that might be in any way based on body status. Empty nesters who may mourn how the family structure was set up before, or not being able to parent in person. Someone who loses a job or switches careers, or someone who loses affiliation with a particular group or religious community. So loss of identity is another form. The loss of safety, which I mentioned before, being able to no longer be able to take for granted that we're just going to be safe and be okay in various places. Physical and emotional well-being. So any survivor of any kind of physical, emotional, or sexual trauma goes through a grieving process. And again, we don't necessarily talk about the grief that comes with those sorts of experiences, but that really sort of having to come to terms with that in the future, once something has happened once, then there's always the reality that could happen again, and having to walk through life with that is that there's a form of grief with that. Families who experience eviction or housing instability, and so many people through this pandemic have lost housing, or had to move in with other people, and that losing that sense of autonomy. Children of divorce, grieving the idea of an intact family. Members of a community who've encountered violence and felt destabilized or unsafe. So thinking about the various communities where there have been police shootings, for example, certainly losing that sense of physical and emotional safety, or having it even further eroded. A person discovering that a partner's romantic infidelity has occurred, that there often is a period of having to come to terms with what we thought was, meeting the reality that our narrative about the past isn't accurate. Then we have to find a way to take what has already happened and combine that with the new information to form like a new narrative that incorporates all of it. And that can be incredibly painful. A psychologist that I followed, she talked about it in terms of infidelity, of that because the future is so unstable, we count on the past to be stable. And so when something comes to light that is a shock, then we have to go through this process of figuring out, was all of it a lie? Was every anniversary, every trip, everything how could that be true? And this secret be true, like all at the same time. So that's a grieving process as well. Anytime that we have a loss of autonomy, whether that's permanent or temporary, there's a loss there, losing the ability to manage one's own life or affairs. So even people who've lost use of a leg, if there's been an injury and wearing a cast for a period of time, even if that's temporary, there's still a grieving process of not being able to just fully do everything that person's accustomed to doing. And certainly that grief's more pronounced when it's a permanent change.
Like I experienced that when my chronic pain developed on my neck. Mm-hmm. And how many times I just feel like like I couldn't do anything. I couldn't help around the house and do things like I used to do and wanted to do. And then once I got that under control, then I wanted to do more, but I'm still realizing I can't do but so much though, it's like, I don't feel like I'm contributing as much as you do. It's like when we moved on Insurrection Day, mm-hmm. You did, she worked nonstop without eating or drinking to get out of the house. And I was just sitting there and not being able to do much, but just logistic stuff, which was helpful, but I couldn't physically do things like I used to. So yeah. Loss of autonomy is a tough one to deal with.
Yeah.
For sure. And mine wasn't like I'm a man, that kind of thing. It was more of, I can't physically help, mm-hmm. With this process, man, that we need to get out of this house and things like that, so.
Yeah, and when we talk about the stages of grief, that the helpless feeling, but also at times like guilt, whether it's justified or not, or even makes sense or not, but that's a really common emotion that comes with it. And people even grieve medical conditions for which there's a complete recovery, but just even losing the ability to take for granted that your body will just do what you want it to do, and hope it will do. Like that never, that never comes back. That being able to take for granted piece, even if that particular illness, there's a full recovery from. So that, loss of autonomy is definitely kind of one of those places. And financial setbacks, which again is, as a nation with how many people were below the poverty line even prior to COVID, and then with all of the job loss and all of the struggles that came with the pandemic, experiencing financial setbacks is tied into our sense of autonomy, and definitely reduces our options the more financially strained we are. And then the last category that I'll mention here is the loss of dreams or expectations, dealing with hopes and dreams going unfulfilled. So a couple who struggles with infertility, for example, and imagined having their own biological family, who now has to face other options. An overachieving student who struggles to find their place in the real world. So maybe someone who had the lead role in all the plays in high school and then goes to college and doesn't even get cast in the first production, and kind of coming to terms with that future. Or someone whose community took a political turn in an unwanted direction. I know recently a school board member in our community was elected who is anti-BLM and against critical race theory being taught, and just the grief of coming to terms with that particular part of the district voted that person in, and grief of accepting that's who's representing, that portion of the town. So this type of grief is characterized by a deep sense of disorientation, particularly at the beginning, because we walk around with this vision of how we thought our lives would look or how they would play out. And when life events violate those expectations, we can feel a sense of unfairness and of deep grief. So really all the forms we talked about so far are applicable, as we're going to talk about stages of grief, that they would be present really in any of these types of loss. So I just put a quick list together of some.
I was going to say, no, I think it's interesting that you even equated, like losing a job or losing a financial status or something like that for grief, or even just that other example of like the town changing their I guess their ideology. I've never really looked at it as grief before. I guess that's a new way to look at it, at least from my perspective. But it's interesting that you said that. So, I'm sorry. Could continue.
Oh.
I just lost my train of thought there. But yeah.
No, I appreciate that.
Well, I was going to say that, this last one with autonomy and expectations, we can say that sometimes when people have a lot of certifications and things like that, but they don't get a job like they were expecting or thought they would, or they were in a job, they lost a job, and then even though they have a lot of experience, they still have problems finding a job as well. Because that, having those years of experience, those certifications, just kind of feel like no problems finding a job, but it's still not happening as fast as they had hoped it would, or as soon as they hoped they would.
Which also I think gives us some insight into, for example, people who have left their countries because are in a refugee status. I remember working at the University of Vermont, and a gentleman who worked in the custodial staff and came in my office to empty the trash cans, and he and I were speaking, and he had been like the equivalent of an attorney in his home country, and just thinking of all the in addition to the loss of life and the loss of home and the loss of culture, and all the transitions in coming to the U.S., that because of the language barrier, like having so few job options to choose from, and just imagining like the grief of, and he had chosen that job because his daughters could then could have tuition remission. So that's why he was working in that particular job, but thinking just the loss of that professional identity and taking a job that was in such a different, used such different skills, and how many of his skills were no longer being used on a regular basis. So we can see the compound grief that comes with major life changes, like having to leave a war zone and be in a new country. So there's just a list of all kinds of different things, and some of them we don't necessarily associate with loss, like pregnancy. A lot of people associate that with positivity, and while there's certainly joyful feelings, there also can be a grief process there, grieving the kind of parenting maybe that someone didn't have as a child. Even the sense of as pregnancy progresses and birth is on the horizon, losing that closeness. And life course theorists would say every single stage of development, there's a series of gains and losses. And we think more about the gains, like a baby gains the ability to crawl and the ability to walk. With that, though, comes some of the closeness and the amount of like holding and cuddling that happened, when a baby was 6 months old. So thinking, even across the life course, that every single stage also includes losses. So acknowledging those realities and making space for those feelings, because I think a lot of times if we don't have that conceptualization, we often invalidate our experiences or are judgmental with ourselves about really normal emotions that we experience, really in any of these kinds of situations. So once someone has experienced any of the kinds of losses we've talked about so far, there are many normal grief reactions. So when experiencing grief, it's common to have thoughts like, am I going crazy? Or like, I feel totally out of sorts. Having difficulty concentrating. It can be hard to attend to anything really other than the loss, or getting sort of stuck in thoughts about the loss, the past, the future, feeling sad or depressed. It can be hard to distinguish like what sadness and when does that cross into the line of clinical depression. And that's certainly something we can talk about in this series as well. Feeling irritable or angry. And sometimes there's secondary guilt or shame to feeling angry, particularly if the anger is at the deceased, the loved one who has passed, or anger with oneself or others or God. Any of those feelings of anger are really normal. But again, a lot of people have been socialized that feeling angry is unkind, or like good people don't feel that way, or nice women don't, feel angry. Yet it's a really common, anger is one of the stages of grief that we'll talk more about. Feeling frustrated, feeling misunderstood. Sometimes in grief, it can almost feel like, how can the world, like even just anger that the world keeps going on. I remember after my mom died, in the first few days afterwards, just like seeing people at the grocery store and like, Mart, like, how can they just be like carrying on their business? Like, don't they know like my mom is dead? And of course they don't. And everyone just keeps moving on with life. But it's really normal to feel frustrated and like no one else gets it. Experiencing anxiety, nervousness, fearfulness, it's really normal to get preoccupied with like losing potentially other people. I remember having those thoughts too after the loss of both my parents, actually, of thinking like no one else better die for like at least 10 years because like I just can't handle it. And that, just that fearfulness and knowing how fleeting, I don't know how temporary everything can be. Feeling like you want to escape, like it just hurts so much you just don't want to exist anymore. That's a really normal feeling, and humans have found really creative ways to escape destructively, which we'll talk a bit about, and we'll talk about some alternatives to doing that, because the desire to want to escape is really valid, and there can be some really destructive ways to try to achieve that, and we'll talk about some healthier ways to achieve that. Needing a break from how much it hurts. The experience of guilt or remorse is a natural part, no matter how much we lived up to our values around like being a daughter, being a spouse, or being a friend, or whoever in the final days of someone's life. It's almost universal that we still feel remorse and regret and think, I should have spent more time with this person. If only I had checked on them more often. I should have spent more time. So just to know, if you have those thoughts, that's really normal. It doesn't necessarily mean that those thoughts are true. They can feel real even if they're not accurate. Feeling ambivalent, feeling like I could take it or leave it. I don't care if I go on vacation this year or if I don't, or if we even celebrate the holidays this season, those kind of feelings. Sometimes feeling numb, just feeling completely detached and disconnected, and lacking energy and motivation. And having the thought, like, why bother, way more often. That's something that I hear from a lot of folks when they're really in the depths of grieving, of feeling like, what's the point of anything? And or even having the thoughts like, I don't know if I want to be in a world without this person. That those thoughts are really normal grief reactions as well.
And just to put this in context, I'm not going to drop names because of, things are alleged. But, we had someone in the InfoSec community who was alleged to have done some pretty heinous things. And when I talked to you about that, you said, well, yeah, I see a lot of these things. People were numb, people were surprised, angry. Like, wait, how could I have not known this? Why didn't I see through this? That kind of thing. People who know this person personally, been in their house and present with them. And then this comes out, it's like, wait a minute. There's no way this is true, or this can't be true. And, the anger that people felt as a result of that, that's a form of grief as well. That that relationship that you were telling me.
Well, and even that disbelief, like having a hard time like wrapping one's head around this new reality, and we talked about that the sort of bargaining phase of grief of like, I should have known, if only I had asked more questions, or those sorts of things, which again are pretty universal and doesn't mean that the content of those thoughts are true. All and feeling shocked and numb and ambivalent and all of those feelings. Sorry, excuse me.
So, I mean, just to touch on that, let me make sure I come back on the screen so people just don't think it's a voice. Let's see here. Minimize. There we go. Okay. Let me close this out. Okay. So to Dwayne's point when he said, when you get that information and um it's hard to believe, or when you deal with almost even the same time when you deal with a loss, and you kind of go that through that initial phase of shock, right? Because um for example, a couple weeks ago, and I talked about it on the show, a friend of mine who I grew up with passed away, and
Mm.
it was just like I said, it was a complete shock to not only me but to everybody. um and I remember just kind of at first it was just a feeling of like, no, there's, that can't be true. No, it BS or whatever. And then it turned to, a little bit of anger and a lot of questions. And then it made you kind of, question your own, morality. Um, or not, no, I mean, not morality, mortality. And I just remember feeling just like overwhelmed. And then um and then one of the other things is when going through those things, usually I kind of just say, all right, whatever, I'm just going to keep my head down and focus on whatever it is I need to focus on. But lately I've been noticing that it's been a lot harder to do that. And I wasn't the only one. I think someone else talked about it on Twitter too, like, dealing with stress and grief and stuff like that and trying to work, but it's almost like your brain is in a fog, like you just can't function. um, is that a normal thing, or is that like the brain fog and feeling, just kind of feeling like you just can't do it, or like it's almost like I feel like I've taken a step back in my career from a technical standpoint, right? Like it's almost like I forget how to type certain commands sometimes, and it's just like, okay, so I know something's going on with me, but this is usually how I coped, and now that doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, it is really normal, like to answer that question. And my condolences. That it sounds really shocking.
Yep.
And it's a different kind of grief journey when it is unexpected. The loss, it doesn't mean it's any more or less painful than when someone has a terminal illness and we go through those stages. But it is that disbelief and just really feeling like everything that we thought we could that we understood about life or whatever's kind of shaken up. And the cognitive load that places on us is real. And like your ability to concentrate and focus, your processing speed, like really a lot of elements of executive functioning that's part of cognition are affected in a period of grief. And I think our culture actually doesn't do a very good job of functionally validating that by like giving people adequate time off, time to grieve. The standard bereavement time is like 1 to 3 days for most companies. Like if it's a parent or a spouse, maybe 10. When the reality is like it can take many weeks sometimes for us to feel like we're kind of back to our full functioning self. So I don't know if that was if I don't know how long ago your loss occurred, but it's so normal in the first few months to not feel like you're able to function at the capacity that you're used to.
Like someone just posted, like people expect you to bounce back all of a sudden, like real quick, like, okay, okay, that was a couple of weeks ago. It's time for you to get back into the groove of things, the expectation that you should just get over it, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, Kalila Scott just said changing life is difficult, and the thought of people to think that we can just bounce back is kind of selfish on them. It is not really easy all the time for the strong folks. Absolutely right.
Yeah. And it's coming to terms with like a new future in which that person is not with us. And that's an ongoing process too. And we continue to grieve as that person's birthday rolls around and graduation happens and they're not there, or the wedding happens and that person isn't there to walk someone down the
or
aisle.
song or a TV show.
Yeah.
any kind of trigger, anything can trigger it.
Or even, my mom passed away 11 years ago, and I still, like the other day, saw this JFK conspiracy theory thing, and I was like, I should tell my mom that, like she would love this, and just thinking, oh, the next time, even just still having that thought of like, I'll tell her the next time I talk to her, and then being like, oh yeah, I'm not going to be talking to her. That's like it's a new event that reminds us of the loss, because they're still not there moving forward. So it's really recalibrating and coming to terms with like a whole new life moving forward, in which that person or people aren't there.
Right. Absolutely. Like I said, my brother passed away 9 years ago now, and it's still the same thing. And like you were saying, like birthdays, certain events, it's still like, wow. Like I still have his number in my phone, so it it's just something that you just kind of never really get past. You just kind of have to deal with. But I'm sorry. You can you can continue your.
Well, I was gonna say my grandfather, I was at his bedside when he died, and I still got his business card in my wallet. That was like 11, 12 years ago now.
Yeah. I still have some of my dad's voicemails. That like once in a while I still like listen to, that are just like, hey, call me, but because I think we keep those things, I think, to some extent, to keep our half of that relationship alive, because as long as we're still here, half of the relationship still is.
Right.
And it's a really normal thing, by the way, it's a really normal thing to talk to the departed. People don't talk about it a lot because of fear of judgment, but over half of people surveyed acknowledge that they do, pray and talk to them, or go to a cemetery and talk to them, or even just in their own mind, talk to people who have deceased. So that's really normal too. And I encourage people to normalize that, because we do continue to have like our part of the relationship, as long as we're alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I know we just had that kind of list of really normal reactions after a loss, that different experts have kind of come up with, just sort of like their different developmental models for different things, that I pull from the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was kind of one of the first sociologists to write about death and loss, and kind of coin different stages of grieving. There are other models, but that's what I'm pulling from here. So the 5 stages that she references are the stage of denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And just want to point out that people who are grieving don't necessarily go through the stages in the same order, or experience all of them, or only go through them once. I think of it as much more like a spiral, and kind of going around in one loop of grief, one stage of grief, and then finding myself in another. Doesn't mean I won't go back to another. So again, for anyone who has had a shocking death, with that denial, the denial and isolation, that one likely will come up multiple times, again, compared to maybe a death that was much more forecastable, or that someone was actually even grieving. Anticipatory grief is a thing where people start grieving even before the death, when they know someone is terminally ill. So some of those stages of grief even happen before, but when it's a shocking one, that denial and disbelief tend to come up more often following the loss.
Dab, you want to read Kellen's comment there?
Sure. So, yep. Kellen, thank you for the comment. Says, I always feel there's no room for the business to take a hit, where they understand we have pain, but it's not acceptable. Our loss will affect the business.
Yeah, just that functional invalidation of that grief is supposed to fit kind of in this tiny swath of time, and outside of that, that it's somehow inappropriate or something, when it's really normal. And again, I like to talk with people about grief, because I feel like there's not enough conversation about it, and really want to normalize people's responses, and particularly when it does take weeks and months to really come to terms with the loss. Not that there still won't be grief down the line. And I know prior to having close losses in my life, I would hear people say like, it doesn't get better, it gets different, or whatever. And I kind of didn't know exactly what they meant by that, but now like I understand what that feels like, of it's coming to terms with a whole new life and a whole new, like, resetting expectations for the future, with the reality of the facts, that person is no longer here, or those people are no longer here. So any of these stages are normal, and we can rotate, back through them. And sometimes we get stuck in one longer than others. That's okay. It kind of runs its own course. And I think of stages of grief kind of like a fever. When you're ill, like a fever takes its time. Like it comes and it runs its course, and it kind of finishes when it finishes, and moves into the next stage. And we kind of can't just rush or will ourselves to just be through one stage of grief. Or just to try to skip them all and get to acceptance right away. That it's more painful, and it takes longer for I think our minds to really accept in a deep way the reality. So that first stage, denial and isolation, the first reaction to learning about terminal illness or loss or death is to deny the reality of the situation. Like, no, this can't be true. Like, no, this isn't real. This isn't happening. It's a normal reaction to rationalize our overwhelming emotions. And in a way, I think our brains kind of protect us as well, and we can only deal with so much at a time. So, maybe like in the depths of it, and then thinking, no, this can't be true, in a way to give ourselves a break from just that overwhelming emotion for a second, kind of like lets us come up for air. So it's a healthy thing to have some denial come in. I think like we need it to preserve our sanity. It's a defense mechanism that buffers that immediate shock of the loss, and it numbs us to our emotions temporarily. So blocking out the words, hiding from the facts. We want to believe that life is meaningful, and the loss can really throw that for a loop. And it's hard to face just the raw pain of that. So it's a temporary response that can carry us through the first wave of pain. And this can also happen with a person who is facing the loss, or like, so for example, my dad was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer. It was a cartilage cancer. And the people who got that particular kind of cancer, like no one's lived longer than a year. And he was 62. So he was in good health prior to that. And it was really shocking. And it was interesting to watch the denial come in for him at certain times, where at some moments, I mean, he wrote a letter to his landlord to get out of his lease that said, like, this is a term, like I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer, like that, I don't envision that I'll last longer than a year. He only was alive 4 months after he was diagnosed. And then other moments he was like, yeah, I think I'm going to get some chemo, and then I'll like get an RV, and I'll probably do that for a couple years. And like us just looking at Dwayne and I looking at each other like, what is he talking about? Like, we know what the news is, like we know what the reality is, but I think he just had to hold on hope. He was obsessed with this proton beam therapy that he was not a candidate for, but he was like insistent that if he just got that, but then he would come to terms with that wasn't a reality, and that he just was going to have some radiation. Anyway, just he went in and out of that denial and disbelief, but at other times made perfect sense. And it wasn't that he was a very bright man, that he understood it, but his brain like kind of didn't let him sometimes. So just giving him the space to have his own process. And I would just let him talk, and it would come and go. Anger, as I mentioned before, is a common stage of grief, and pretty universal. And we might have anger about different components of the loss. As the masking effects of denial kind of wear off, like angry that we have to feel this much pain, we're not ready. And so that intense emotion is often deflected and redirected into anger. It's not fair. And, some existential anger sometimes, like, why do I have to live in a world where this happens? I remember feeling really angry that he never got his first retire. He was supposed to get his first like Social Security check like the month after he died. And it was like he worked his whole life. He never even got one check. It's like, it's so unfair. And really just kind of channeling that grief energy, that sadness into like anger temporarily, I think is a break from just this sad, cold, hard, empty aloneness that we feel in grief. So sometimes it can be aimed at inanimate objects. People have like lost it and destroyed, some items in the storage garage or whatever, just out of frustration, and can aim anger at complete strangers, friends and family. Sometimes people get into arguments with family members that make no sense, like right after the loss. And that's, again, like really common. It's usually not about whatever the topic was that the argument sprung out, but just everyone's raw feelings being directed in that way. We may direct our anger at the dying or the deceased loved one. Rationally, we may know that person's not to blame for the situation. They didn't cause it, yet it's normal to feel that way, and to trust that they could even support us in that anger. Like, I know the anger that I've had around my parents' deaths, like that. I know if they could talk to me right now, that they would tell me that it was okay that I felt angry at them, for leaving us, for their death causing so much pain. And sometimes we feel guilty for being angry, and that can make us more angry. So I think I mentioned that before, that sort of secondary guilt or shame around the fact that anger came up at all. So
that anger is sometimes a way of masking the pain.
Yeah.
And the pain comes back, may fall back to anger, so they won't deal with the pain of it. We just redirect that pain to a different emotion, if you will.
Yeah. And there's like some energy in anger, whereas some of the other stages of grief, like they just feel cold and empty and alone. And so again, I think it's like our brain trying to take care of itself and giving us a break from the other painful kind of dimensions of grief.
Yeah, is that also like some people will work a whole lot more because it's more of the anger, just energy. That's interesting. I never thought about that. That's giving them the energy they need. They want to not deal with the pain. That's what you're saying there. Oh, they're going to lead to a hard crash, though.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah, and secondary. I mean, depending on like how the anger is expressed, could also lead to like more complicated family dynamics and everything in the wake of, in the wake of that. I think all of us probably know people that after someone passed and there was a bunch of drama around like the will and who got what, that often it isn't about the money or the grandma's necklace or the whatever. It's just like a flashpoint in which all of these like this pent up emotion is like discharged at other members of the family. Bargaining is another common stage of grief. And this is where we have the what if thoughts or the if only kinds of thoughts. So normal reaction to feelings of helplessness and vulnerability. It's almost like this need to regain control. So we almost kind of try to talk ourselves into this idea that if we had done something different, the outcome would have been different, to give us a false sense of power. So like, if only we'd sought medical attention for this person sooner, if only I'd visited them, more, those kinds of things, in an attempt to bargain. So secretly we may like make a deal with God or our own higher power in an attempt to postpone the inevitable and the pain that would come with that. And it's a way of distracting us, I think, from the painful reality, again, like a distraction from the sadness. And guilt often accompanies the bargaining. I know with my dad, I got really stuck on that we were supposed to have longer, like he had moved to live with us, and we'd never got that time. So like in my mind, we were going to have like bonfires, and he was going to teach my son how to pitch and baseball and all these things. And like, I just was like stuck on that we were supposed to have the summer because he died June 1st. And I remember like a friend of mine who's a therapist saying like, so then if you'd had the summer, then like when he died at the end of the summer, like it would have been okay. And I was like, obviously not. And that helped me kind of move through that stage where I was just so stuck on that. And so if you've experienced that yourself or heard someone else kind of get stuck on, but it was supposed to be this way or that way, that's bargaining. And then depression and sadness. So two types of depression associated with mourning. The first is the reaction to the practical implications of the loss. Like, I'm never going to talk to this person again. They're never going to be with us at the holiday. Worrying about the costs of the burial or, the arrangements. If the person was younger, figuring out who's going to help take care of their kids, who's going to play this role in the family, who's going to cut the turkey at Thanksgiving, those kinds of things. And then the second type of depression is more subtle and more private, and that's that quiet preparation to separate and bid farewell to our loved ones. So the sadness and depression, and I think you were speaking about this a little bit ago, of facing our own mortality. And when someone close to us has died, it's just really in our face that we too will die. If this could happen to them, it will happen to us. And there's a deep despair that can come with that realization. And a common thing that people have happen, particularly when generations above us have died, this feeling like we're closer to death somehow, like a layer between death and us has been removed if our grandparents or parents or aunts and uncles pass, and just how sad it is to face our own.
That's what Taekwon Gong posted here. I wrestled with thoughts of inadequacy, then thinking about family who died from COVID and thinking about my own mortality.
Yeah.
So I'm very similar to what you were just talking about.
Yeah. And, with COVID, I imagine for those of you who've lost loved ones to this pandemic, some survivor's guilt is also tied into the depression and sadness and feeling like, like why them and not me? And again, tied into the bargaining, if only people had taken more precautions, if only we'd known earlier, like how to protect ourselves from this, if only our government had dealt with it more effectively. Like all, those kinds of thoughts can be tied into that depression or sadness phase. And then acceptance, which can take a long time to get to. And just because we get to acceptance doesn't mean we won't rotate back through any of the other stages. But when we come to acceptance, really coping with the loss and recognizing that it will have implications moving forward, but essentially coming to terms with this is the reality. And by doing so, that in no way means that like we're okay with it or that that anything about it is okay. It just is acknowledging. I think acceptance in this sense, the closest synonym I have is like acknowledgement, acknowledging that the reality is what it is, and that that life can be worth living even with really painful events as part of that process. So the best thing you can do is allow yourself to feel the different emotions that come with grief as they come over, because resisting it will only prolong the natural process of healing. By doing exposure to the emotion, like letting the emotion come and wash over us in waves, a wave of sadness eventually will peak and it will dissipate. Another one may follow right behind. But all emotions are temporary. Nothing will last. No emotion will last forever. So allowing ourselves to really face it and feel it and sit in it, which is really hard to do. And it takes a lot of courage to allow ourselves to feel in a deep way all the different emotions that come in grief. And we're going to talk about, I think, in the remainder of our time today, as well as next week, we'll really focus on different coping strategies and ways of coming to acceptance or continuing to turn our mind towards the path of acceptance while tolerating the painful emotions that come with the loss. Any other questions or comments before I get into coping? Okay.
Kalila said this was very helpful.
Good. So with, sometimes the first thing to do when it comes to emotions is nothing, to just letting it be, not doing something to try to get rid of it, tolerating the distress. So we're going to talk about bearing pain skillfully and having the ability to accept in a non-judgmental fashion both ourselves and the situation, as well as like other people's behaviors and other people's choices. Adopting a non-judgmental stance, so not one of approval or resignation. Becoming capable of calmly recognizing the situation, their impact, how we feel, rather than becoming overwhelmed or hiding from that. And allowing us to make wise decisions about whether and how to take action, rather than falling into despair, giving up, giving in, or engaging in self-destructive patterns, which are really common. People sort of joke about like alcohol use increases, through the pandemic or whatever. Alcohol consumption did go up, I think 19% for the average family, like over this last year. So finding alternatives to doing things that cause more of a problem for my future. How I talk about it with clients and how I think about it sometimes is, how can I cope with this in a way that's not going to make the future harder for future Megan to deal with? And so we'll look at some of those options. So I want to talk about acceptance for a minute. So in the context of coping with loss, acceptance meaning to come to terms with something, to acknowledge a fact or truth and come to terms with it, to endure. Again, that is not approval. That's not, it's okay. It's not excusing anything. It's just taking life as life is. And not increasing suffering by refusing to accept. Because refusing to accept is fall down drunk. Refusing to accept is picking a fight with everybody everywhere, and not dealing with the sadness. So we're going to look at ways of enduring, of handling the pain gracefully. Radical acceptance is like completely surrendering and submitting to the reality as it is, to see something as it is, no more, no less, and to fully like embrace that reality and to behave as though that reality is that reality.
So someone dies and you're just like, okay, they died. I need to do these things to keep moving on. There's nothing that I can do about the situation. Kind of thing. Is that what that
it is? But also, yeah. As I, sometimes that also means I know when my mom died, my oldest was 3 years old, and I was a solo parent, and I had to make time. Like I would go home from work early, and I would just get out photos and a tissue box, and I would just let the sadness come over me. Because before I went and picked him up from daycare, because when I didn't, that's when I would start sobbing in Rite Aid, like in line, or that's where like it would just start popping out other places. So accepting that loss meant I needed to make time to grieve. Like I had to carve out time to let myself feel the feelings. And so if that's not something that you're doing, I would really encourage you to find places where you can like give yourself that space to feel the feelings, and whether that's anger, whether that's sadness, whether that's guilt, to like sit in it, to let it wash over you for a period of time, and then to put it in a box, kind of, imagine putting it in a box and putting it on the shelf. You're not pretending it doesn't exist, but then you do, wash your face and go pick up the kid from daycare and make dinner, or, whatever the next thing is. So I think healthy grief is a balance of living and feeling, continuing to live life for the future and feeling in a deep way the empty, cold loss of that person no longer being there. I don't know if we need to go over coping mindsets, but I guess the idea I want to highlight here is that the Buddhists would say like life is pain, like there's no way around it, thinking about all the different ways that humans can feel pain. We can feel pain from like temperatures being too hot or too cold, and GI pain, all kinds of pain, emotional pain. And when we don't accept that, we perpetuate suffering. And the suffering is refusing to accept reality. It shouldn't be this way. Why me? It's not fair. Getting sucked into those sort of vortex swirls of thought, like that's the suffering part. And that part's optional. Like if we allow the pain, then we don't have to do the suffering on top of the pain. So pain is required, suffering's optional. And acceptance sometimes is the way out of hell. Or at least that's what the psychologist who originated the theory I practice from says. So in terms of acceptance, the past is the past, and those events can't ever be changed. So one area that we can work on accepting at any given time is anything in the past. Those days unfolded exactly as they did. Nothing will ever be different in the past. There are things in the present that can't be changed, and there are things in the present that can be changed. So we don't have to sort of accept anything in the future. It's not here yet. There are things in the present that we may need to accept that just can't be changed. And we may accept that things are as they are and be working on changing them at the same time. So acceptance doesn't mean not changing. Sometimes we can be doing both. And it behooves us to accept reality because pain can't be avoided. Rejecting reality turns pain into suffering. Denying reality doesn't change reality. So if you've ever said, well, this is unacceptable, it rarely makes the thing different. I can judge it as unacceptable, yet it still is. Changing reality requires accepting reality because we really can't deal with a situation that we've not acknowledged. Accepting may increase sadness at first, but often leads to peace and freedom. And the path out of hell is through misery. So being willing to accept the painful emotions is what lets us get through them and to the other side. And then there's some non-acceptance examples include like lying, denial, blaming, avoidance, substance use, eating disorder behavior, any of that kind of stuff.
Anything you're doing that doesn't try to find some time to deal with the pain.
Mm-hmm.
When like working a lot,
mm-hmm.
overworking,
mm-hmm.
pushing yourself, using that anger energy for not accepting, not trying to work with the pain.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Or the denial, or and it's bizarre because sometimes we'll hear people say like so and so's coping so well with that death, like they showed up to work the next day, like they've never talked to, like they never, they don't cry, and I'm like, oh, I'm like worried where that's blowing up or bubbling up, or
mm-hmm.
What kind of repressed emotional problems are brewing from not accepting and dealing with it. Okay, so You talked a bit about acceptance, and it's like next week we will go in depth with like concrete strategies to use, particularly times when it feels like the emotional pain is so much that it's like almost unbearable to like exist in your skin for another minute. Times where people like say that they feel like ripping their face off or like feel like they just can't go on. How to get through those minutes without making it worse. So crisis survival, which the definition of surviving a crisis is getting through without making it worse. Um, yeah, so we'll be looking at those things. Next week we'll talk about distress tolerance, mindfulness, different mindfulness skills. We'll do some exercises together here to have some concrete strategies. So to kind of sum up tonight, just hope that as you move through life, look at the events of the last year, of the changes that have happened in your life. That you have this framework and maybe even identify some things as losses that you didn't think of as losses, and some of the emotional responses that you've had to them that maybe you've been judgmental with yourself about, that you can be more gentle with yourself about it and say, like, this is actually really common. It's so common. It was in a presentation that I tuned into on June 21st under normal reactions to grief and loss. That you have that framework to understand yourself. And then to be able to self-validate and maybe to be able to speak to yourself in ways that you would speak to someone else about what they were going through. You would say, well, like, it makes sense that you're feeling this way. You had this childhood friend pass away, with shockingly with little notice, or you've not been able to see your family for over a year, and particularly the people who've lived alone through COVID, like all those holidays that passed and just being alone in the house, like there's so many losses happened in terms of what we thought the year was going to look like that didn't. And so making space for some of those feelings, and giving yourself permission to feel those emotions without judgment. And in a way to try to acknowledge them the same way you would if you felt, I don't know, if you felt wet or cold. You wouldn't be like, it's stupid that I'm feeling cold right now. You'd be like, I'm feeling cold because it's cold. I'm feeling wet because water just was thrown upon me. Like, I'm feeling sad because I've experienced this loss, or this series of losses. And being kind with yourself, giving yourself that kindness and compassion.
Yeah. To make sure I'm so thank you for that presentation. And like I said, it's definitely been helpful to a lot of people in the chat, that I actually call my pack, my wolf pack. So yeah, Kalila Scott talked about how it was helpful, talking about, her dealing with her own grieving situation, and then how she just kind of smiles and just deals with it, but she's not okay. And you brought up a lot of good points with the avoidance, the just kind of trying to work and overwork, and for you, like I said before, for years that was how I dealt with it, because I also dealt with a lot of loss from a young age up until um, presently. And it was just always, I'm just going to channel it somewhere else, because I did deal with some of the things, with whether it was alcohol or whatever, just living recklessly. Um, and it was never really, explained to me, and it's not to anyone else's fault or detriment, but it was never really explained that this is unhealthy. So it was kind of just going through the motions. So another reason why I felt like this conversation is super important. Um, we also have someone here. E Brown says, "Good info. I struggle with guilt due to the suicide of my first husband, and never got a chance to fully grieve. Just moved on with life, and just wish you could do more. And that's the feeling like you could do more, that you should have done more. I know that they say it's normal and it's a normal thing to do. But it's hard. Like I still question certain things that, were, I mean, just kind of cut and dry, it was just like, it wasn't like something that was it wasn't under questionable circumstances. It was just like, this is exactly what happened. Here with the chain of events without going into detail. So again, so thank you for shedding some light on that, because like I said, and I know you want to talk about it next week, but I think I can't speak for a lot of other communities, but I'm noticing in the InfoSec community, all we end up doing is just kind of throwing ourselves into more work, you know, more things to hack or more things to protect and just whatever, and then we're kind of stuck with this feeling of burnout on top of the grief. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation with you next week and talking more about the coping strategies and everything like that. But again, I thank you, Dwayne. As always, I thank you for joining and sharing that presentation. And I thank everybody who's here, whether you're here live right now or you'll be here on the replay. I thank and appreciate you all for joining and sharing this information. Again, this is the
Thank you, Devin, for hosting. Appreciate
Oh, not a problem, not a problem. And like I said, again, this is the first of a two-part conversation. So again, if you did miss the live or you did miss it right now, don't worry. It will be up very shortly. Um, I'll be sharing it. Dwayne and Megan will also be sharing it, and we're gonna get this conversation out there to as many people, because I definitely think it's something that definitely needs to be talked about more open and honestly. And I think that's something that we could probably talk about next week too, is the stigma behind it. How, especially people in the Black community, we don't talk about mental health. It was always like taboo, or like it was almost like there's nothing wrong with you, especially in the West Indian and Caribbean households. You never talked about that. It was like just no. So I just think these are definitely things that we should have we should talk about more. So again, I know it's a little bit over 7:30, but Megan, Dwayne, thank you. Like I said, this has been very helpful, and this is the first part. So for those who are watching my pack, I appreciate you all. Tell a friend to tell a friend to please check out the replay, and please come back next Monday where we'll have part 2, where Megan will talk about the coping strategies, and we'll have a little bit more conversation about some of the things we've been talking about here. So again, this has been I was gonna say this is another Thursday, because that's usually my my closing thing. It's not Thursday; it's actually a Monday. But this has been a special episode of InfoSec Unplugged. I've been your host, Avin Jackson. Again, I want to thank the Dunstons for coming on and sharing this information. And please, like I said, please come back for next week for part 2. And if you missed any of this, the replay is going to be up like sooner than you think. So to all, thank you. And I will see you next week with Megan and Dwayne for part 2.
it. Folks.
Thanks so much.